today. We were going to have a contingent from Wise, but I don't see the people I know. So, okay. Well, anyway, welcome to everybody who's here. It's good to see you all. For opening words, I feel we have, I'm sorry, this is from Pearl Buck because our talk today is going to be about Pearl Buck. I feel no need for any other faith than my faith in the kindness of human beings. I am so absorbed in the wonder of earth and the life upon it that I cannot think of heaven and angels. Our speaker today is Jolie Lewis. To introduce her, Emily will come up and do the honors.
Well, I'm really glad to have Jolie speaking this morning. Jolie Lewis and her husband Jay live in Marion. They've been attending for, is it 2 years? 2 years. They have Caden and Ellie, and we're so glad they're with us. Jolie is the academic advisor and coordinator of orientation for Emory and Henry. And before they moved here, they lived in West Virginia, and there she was on the board of the Pearl S. Buck birthplace in Hillsboro, West Virginia.
All right. Dale, first of all, thank you for reading that quote this morning from Pearl Buck. I had actually hoped that quote came from this, I believe, essay that she did many years ago, and I had hoped to be able to play it at the end of my talk today, and I had gone online and downloaded it, and it turned out I didn't really download it, that it was just like an internet access thing, so I don't actually have it, and I'm sorry about that. And I hadn't used it in my own talk because I was planning to have it in her voice, and I'm sorry that we're going to miss out on that. So from 2009 to 2013, I served on the board of directors at the Pearl Buck Birthplace Foundation in West Virginia. The birthplace is a quaint little museum in the home where Pearl Buck was born in 1892. It's located in Pocahontas County, which is on the eastern side of the state, on the rolling plains of the Greenbrier Valley, backed by the foothills of the Alleghenies. It's very rural. Pocahontas is the least densely populated county in West Virginia. Its largest city of Marlinton has a population of about 1,000 people. So the birthplace, just for the sake of giving you a visual, is it's a 2-story white wooden frame house, about as deep as it is wide as it is tall, so it looks kind of like a cube. It has a wide, flat front, which is broken only by a bay window, and a 2-story portico that has a grapevine twining across a sweet little 2nd-story porch. The museum is filled with all kinds of family and regional mementos from the late 1800s. There's her father's massive Bible, the bicycle he used to travel around the Chinese countryside to preach the word of Christ, a full library of the more than 100 books that Pearl Buck wrote during her lifetime, her grandfather's meticulously crafted woodwork, and the occasional oddity, like a hair wreath, which the family made by weaving all their hair together in the shapes of flowers and leaves. I don't know if any of you have ever seen one of those. They're really interesting. The birthplace came into existence as a museum in the 1960s when a local newspaper editor and the West Virginia Women's Clubs, with fundraising help from Pearl herself, bought the property when it came up for sale by a private owner. Pearl was in her 70s then and yearning to do something in honor of her mother, who was a touch point of her life. I was asked to join the board, mainly because I was active in the community and because I was a writer. I said yes, I guess because I'm the kind of person who says yes to things, which I probably shouldn't admit up here, and especially if I think it has any kind of potential to take me on any kind of interesting life adventure. And I was just curious where it would go. I couldn't say that I said yes out of any deep admiration for Pearl or her work. At that time, I hadn't even read The Good Earth, and I hadn't actually visited the birthplace yet, though I had driven by it hundreds or thousands of times and thought it was cool that it was there. I was sort of like, oh, it's great. I work in a town where the first American woman to win the Nobel Prize in Literature was born, and yet I hadn't actually gone there yet. Over the next 4 years, as I got more deeply involved in the birthplace, I helped to start an annual croquet tournament, spearheaded an international program where middle school kids in West Virginia made and traded digital media projects with kids in Morocco, and I helped to make some difficult decisions about the budget, about staffing, and about the collection of Pearl's original manuscripts, which she had given to the birthplace to help it get started. Sometimes it felt like I'd taken on another part-time job. I eventually left the board about a year and a half ago when it became clear that everything was getting to be too much. We were here by then, I had a full-time job, and we had the 2 small kids. So recently I've been working on an essay about Pearl Buck and my experiences on the board, and I've been asking myself, all that work, why did I do it? What meaning did it have for my life? Our Wednesday night UUCH Women's Discussion Group has been talking about happiness this winter, and I'm interested in particular about happiness is related to growth. Pearl herself once said, "Growth itself contains the germ of happiness." I find myself wondering, did I grow from serving on the board? Or was it a little bit of a waste of time, consuming for those 4 years most of the creative energy that I had? I don't have an answer to that yet, totally. It's a question I'm still working on. It's a journey I'm still on. But I do know this. I am now in possession of what feels like, for me, a staggering amount of information about Pearl Buck and her life. And I have developed a deep admiration and sometimes even fascination for her life and her work. She was an amazing woman. But she is, year by year, decade by decade, and especially generation by generation, disappearing from the American public consciousness, even among writers. I recently met a published writer in her late 30s who had never heard of Pearl at all. And that brings me to the framing question for this talk. What do we as a nation lose if we lose Pearl Buck? So Pearl Buck was born in Hillsborough, but she only lived there for 3 tiny little months before her family took her back to China, where her father served as a Presbyterian missionary. And then she visited one time for a year when she was around 9 or 10 years old, and that actually is it. That's almost the entirety of her West Virginia experience, which sort of leads to an interesting side question about why it is that West Virginia feels so strongly about claiming her, and that's actually a whole nother long topic that's pretty interesting. So except for that one year when she was 9 or 10 in those first 3 months, she grew up basically exclusively in China. Her father, Absalom Seidenstricker, could be fairly described as a zealot. In his first 10 years in China, he was able, by his own count, to convert only 10 people to Christianity. 10 people in 10 years. But not for lack of trying. He spent all day, every day preaching, settled his family in cheap quarters in the red light district so he could spend more of his money on his ministry, and in the summer season when disease flared, refused to relocate his family to a cooler climate for fear of missing opportunities to preach. He and his wife ended up losing 4 of their 7 children to disease. Her mother, Carrie, on the other hand, was a gentle soul and a vibrant one. From watching her, Pearl learned about a different kind of ministry, the kind that cares for people. Neighborhood women would come to visit, and Carrie would chat with them, trade advice, and teach their daughters to read. Pearl later wrote, so this is a long quote, "I remember my intrepid mother in the days when I was so small that I had to stretch my mind to understand why in the blackness of a winter night she disguised herself in ragged Chinese garments, stained her face brown, and with a small canvas bag of silver dollars, slipped through our compound gate into the surrounding Chinese city. She crept among the mat huts of famine refugees, and into each she put $1. No, it did not end the famine or prevent another, but what she did was on the side of life. She kept families and human beings alive until something better could be devised. She was always on the side of life, and I am her daughter." As powerful as her connection was with her mother, China and its people were an equally large influence on her. The family's cook and nanny, Wang Ama, dressed Pearl in cloth shoes and a Chinese jacket and pants, let her hang out in the kitchen, told her Buddhist and Taoist stories, and took her to worship in a local temple. Pearl learned to speak Chinese before she spoke English. When the family moved to the countryside, Pearl was given the freedom to roam. Every now and then she would find a tiny human bone and bury it. She later came to understand that these bones had belonged to infant girls who had been killed or abandoned by their families. As she grew older, she was tutored by a Confucian scholar who gave her a basis in Confucian ethics and also in context, always connecting their discussions to past and present events in China, which enabled her for the first time to understand things she had witnessed but hadn't understood because of the limited scope of the missionary view. I titled this talk, A Woman Divided, and I do want to talk about all the divisions in Pearl's life. I think she never felt completely at home anywhere. China was the home of her childhood, and she was familiar with its customs and its language, but she was always an outsider there. As a young wife, she was the first Caucasian to visit some of the villages where she and her husband lived. And she always had to give time when she arrived anywhere for people just to look at her and to touch her. There's a funny story about a woman who meets her, who, upon meeting her for the first time, says in utter surprise, "English is the same as Chinese. I understand her perfectly," when Pearl began speaking to a group in their own language. Neither is Pearl at home in America, having grown up in China. She came to Randolph-Macon for college, feeling a bit awkward with English, the same way she did in the clothes that were the style of the day, and especially with a young woman's interests and preoccupations and points of reference. She came to be one of the great humanists of her generation, but she didn't exactly start off that way. After graduating from college and returning to China, she married Lossing Buck, an agricultural missionary who was also posted in China. In their early years together, she served as a missionary herself. And what I would call one of her lowest moments, she complained in letters to the family about her, quote, constant contact with the terrible degradation and wickedness of a heathen people. In her defense, she had at that time witnessed real atrocities. And one of her biographers points out that she was sort of adopting the vocabulary of the evangelist movement to cope with injustices she had seen against women, such as foot binding and the female infanticide, and the killing of a young girl who had tried to hang herself but had been found in time that she could have been saved, but then was deliberately suffocated to death instead. As she settled into this new town, though, she got to know the people who lived around her, and she came to see them differently. She also figured out how to separate the injustices from the people and from their nation and from their religion. She never in her long life stopped criticizing the unjust treatment of peasant women, but she also found an appreciation for the strength and simplicity of rural farming families. And she came in time to see that the backwardness of missionary evangelism. She believed Western help was needed in China through food, medication, and education. But in 1932, speaking to a group of about 2,000 people at a Presbyterian function, she lambasted the foreign mission. This is a quote again. "I have seen missionaries so lacking in sympathy for the people they were supposed to be saving, so scornful of any civilization except their own, so harsh in their judgment upon one another, so coarse and insensitive among a sensitive and cultivated people, that my heart has fairly bled with shame." There are some rumors after that the most fundamental leaders in the church wanted to try Pearl for heresy. But by then, she had already written and had published The Good Earth, and she was pretty famous and probably too influential to risk taking on in that way. And while she wasn't she was anti-mission in the way that it existed then, she was not anti-Christian. She did become anti-dogma and anti-creed. And she drew likenesses between Buddha and Christ, and she located what she called the truth of Christianity in, quote, the essence of men's highest dreams. A little more biographical information. During the 1930s, she emerged as a powerful voice in advocating for women's rights, including for the development of affordable birth control that could be made available to women around the world, and especially in China. She would have been thinking about the infanticide again here and the hunger. She called Margaret Sanger one of the most courageous women of our times. There's a fascinating interview with Mike Wallace in 1958 in which she denies being a feminist, which is also another interesting side story. Yet in her fiction and essays and humanitarian work, she was constantly questioning the ways women were denied authority and power in their own lives. She was active in the civil rights movement of the 1930s. She wrote regularly for a magazine of the NAACP, and she co-authored a book that was a dialogue on race with a female African-American anthropologist. In 1942, the longtime secretary of the NAACP said at a rally that there are only two people in America who he felt understood the realities of black life, and they were both women, Eleanor Roosevelt and Pearl Buck. One of the most remarkable things that Pearl did was start the first international interracial adoption agency, which she called the Welcome House. The agency found homes for the children who were the unwanted offspring of Asian women and American servicemen who had served overseas. She started the Welcome House in 1949, and 65 years later, the organization is actually still going strong. It's different, but it's still going strong. So I feel like no talk about the Good Earth would be complete, no talk about Pearl Buck would be complete without talking about The Good Earth. The Good Earth was her defining work, a novel about the rise and fall and rise again of a peasant farmer in a rural part of the Anhui province in eastern China, about 200 miles inland from Shanghai. The book was published in 1931, about a year and a half after the stock market crash here in the United States. This was a time when 1 in 4 Americans still made their living farming, and that's compared with 1 in 50 today. And people get their hands on this novel about a farmer and his wife in China who have a deep connection with the land, who, if they work hard and the weather cooperates, in most years can make ends meet or even get a little bit ahead, who find themselves caught in a terrible year-long drought, watching their children starve until it gets so bad that they have to flee to a big city so the man can pull a rickshaw behind him and his wife and his children can beg for food. And these situations in the Great Depression of America are so fundamentally familiar, and the book is written in a way that is so graceful, but still very readable, and it becomes a huge bestseller. And all of a sudden, everything changes in the way the people of the United States view China and its people. And up until this point, really, the sort of common understanding of the Chinese people in our country was based on stereotype and caricature and the kinds of things that might be drawn up in Ripley's Believe It or Not, which was entirely based on just not on fact, on falsehood. So Pearl Buck achieves all this without erasing or minimalizing anything that was part of the Chinese culture that Americans would have found different, whether good or bad. At the height of the drought, a mother does kill her newborn daughter. At the end of the novel, the main character brings a concubine into his home. The family gives its elders precedence, even over the children, even when food is scarce. And people worship and sometimes rail against the gods most American readers would have found unfamiliar at best, heathenish at worst. Nearly everything that happens in the book is presented in the same way, though, non-judgmentally, and with sympathy for the characters and their situation. And this, I suspect, is what enabled readers to see and respect the kinds of otherness, while at the same time identifying deeply with the ways the characters were like them, their love and betrayal, their joy and heartbreak, their hard work, their connection to the land. It's worth noting that we shouldn't mistake a non-judgmental tone for condoning something as awful as infanticide. Anything but. In fact, if you want to change a practice, you'll have a better chance if you can understand the pressures that people are under. A writer like Pearl Buck would have known that in presenting a tragic scene, she didn't have to tell the reader how awful it was. That in fact, it's a more powerful statement, more likely to evoke change when readers come to that understanding for themselves. And Pearl gives plenty of opportunities in The Good Earth, as well as her many later essays, for the reader to see and think about the world's ills: poverty, racism, systems of law that have given men control over their wives, the inability of women to have the power to make decisions about when and how to have a family. So I'll read a short excerpt from the book so you can get a sense of Pearl's writing if you don't already know it, as well as getting a sense of the way the book does explore social injustice, in this case, poverty and hunger. Still, every morning, a little after dawn, Wang Lung and his family come out of their hut, and with their bowls and chopsticks, they made a small group in a long procession of people, each issuing from his hut, shivering in clothes too thin for the damp river fog, walking curved against the chill morning wind to the public kitchens, where for a penny, a man may buy a bowl of thin rice gruel. And with all Wang Lung's pulling and running before his rickshaw, and with all Olan's begging, they never could gain enough to cook rice daily in their own hut. So The Good Earth was published in 1931, which actually, there's a terrible drought in there and terrible famine, which predated the Dust Bowl drought by about 3 years, and was awarded with a Pulitzer Prize in Fiction in 1932. Then in 1938, Pearl was awarded with the Nobel Prize in Literature in a decision that shocked the literary world. Even Pearl herself thought the award should have gone to Theodore Dreiser that year, who was the writer of Sister Carrie and American Tragedy. But context matters. And in 1938, fascism was on the rise in Europe. Just 6 weeks before the award was announced, Hitler had gained control of part of Czechoslovakia through the Munich Agreement. The Swedish Academy, in recognizing the writer of The Good Earth, was recognizing a writer whose work stood for tolerance and for understanding. People have acted as though the influence of the pending war on the prize going to Pearl somehow lessens the merit of the award. I think it increases it. So I asked the question at the beginning, what do we lose if we lose Pearl Buck? And I want to address that in two separate spheres. The first, what does the literary world lose if it forgets Pearl Buck? There are writers that the literary establishment will never lose. Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway. That's just the beginning of the list. And yes, on the longer version of the list, the vast majority of writers will still be men. But Pearl Buck is already mostly forgotten. She's rarely taught in public schools, less taught still in undergraduate programs, and she's especially not taught in MFA programs in creative writing. But there are writers who have cited her as an important influence. Among them, Maxine Hong Kingston and Toni Morrison, who I will note is the only other American woman to date to have won the Nobel Prize in Literature. These are women who, like Pearl, are interested in the collision of cultures, an area of literature that last I knew was growing faster than just about any other. It makes sense to me that we should think of Pearl as a pioneer of this kind of literature. We should be reading and analyzing her work, acknowledging her mistakes, and they are real, they're significant, and also honoring her accomplishments. I also get the sense there's an ongoing conversation in the literary world about how to write about self and other, about what experiences writers have the right to represent and what ones they don't. It's an important conversation to have, a healthy one. Did Pearl Buck have the right to represent the Chinese experience, not having been Chinese? It's a doozy of a question, and the nuances of which we could probably talk about for hours. But the important answer is this. The question of who has the right to represent whom in literature will be richer and more interesting and more productive if we keep Pearl as part of the conversation. Here's what else I think Pearl's work has to say to literature. The Good Earth and some of her best other works have the ability to help literary writers figure out how to navigate the tricky waters where art, with a capital A, and activism, also with a capital A, collide. This is something I'm kind of still working out in my own head, but I'm just really interested in it. I find myself suspicious that it's always been held as inappropriate in literary worlds to let your activism bleed too much into your writing. I feel like the so-called distinction between art and activism is probably full of fallacies, and I hope that thinking about Pearl's work will help me sort out exactly how I feel about that more someday. I think the more important question is, what do we lose as human beings if we lose Pearl Buck? And this answer is actually the simpler one. We lose a great humanist who had the ability to hold in her heart and her mind the complicated truths. The truth that a culture engaged in horrifying practices could also be filled with really good people and have an incredible amount of wisdom. And this, I suspect, is at the heart of humanist thinking, the ability to hate a practice but understand its people. And I'm sure that the lens could be turned the other way and see practices in our country that, are equally appalling, that, if you understand sort of what the system is and that, then you gain a richer understanding of it. If we lose Pearl, we lose someone who always acted, without hesitation, using whatever tools she had at her disposal: language, logic, influence, wealth. She remembered the plight of families in China, and she campaigned for affordable birth control. She saw racial injustice in America, and she spoke out against it. She saw babies unwanted in neither their mother's or their father's countries, and she started an adoption agency. And then she went around her neighborhood, and she pressured all of her friends to adopt children, and they did. I mean, it was a very personal, local level for her. She saw something she wanted to change, and she changed it. I mean, she criticized foreign missionary policy to a group of 2,000 Presbyterians. If we lose Pearl Buck, we lose someone who resisted labels, who refused to succumb to black and white, right or wrong, conservative or liberal, this or that thinking. Forget what box people want to put you in. Speak your truth. Never, ever give up on a vision for a better world.